I asked you to think about vulnerability. I don't know if anybody has enough courage to say what they thought of, but I'm going to have a little fun with you. If anybody wants to jump in, I'm very open to that. In fact, I remember in my Milton days, some of the youngest people in the congregation would say to me, John, Reverend John, I really, I'm okay with sermons, but I'd be more interested if I could actually jump in once in a while and question you. Which, it was a church of 500. We didn't have 500 always, but that's a big church. But so I'm very open at times. If anybody wants to say, hey, I have a little story to share, I'm open on that. So here's a fun one. I shared this at staff. We had a fun time in Fergus the other day. We all have to be a little lighthearted at times. Life is pretty hard. We need to be lighthearted. I sleepwalk from time to time. Usually when I sleepwalk, I'm anxious. And I remember being a young minister. My famous story is I said to God, I'd love to be a minister, but could I kind of skip over the death stuff and the hard stuff? Like, I just want to be the minister. God woke me up pretty early when I was going to ER in Palmerston and people were dying in car accidents. And my wife, being a nurse at the time, was saying, like, my God, you sleepwalk a lot. I really came to realize that sleepwalking for me is often stress. So guess what? First cruise ever, front of the ship. My son and I are in an inside cabin, wife and daughter on the outside. And I had a sleepwalk moment, and I was sure in my dream nightmare that the mustard call had happened, and it was time to get the life jacket on. So I run out of my cabin. Thank God I had boxers on. But those cabin doors lock when they shut. So I woke up going down the hallway, and I realized I didn't have much on, and my son never wakes up for anything, not even in the morning time. So I was very vulnerable, and I just kept banging and banging, and my wife finally heard me. My daughters were even closer to the door. They never heard me, and she basically pulled me on and said, don't dare jump over the balcony, just stay put, kind of. But I realized stress comes out in very different ways. 31 years ago as a young minister, shipped out to Alberta, and I really felt the sense of God calling me. Here we have a story today about God sending us out, sending out as 70. And I think it's a beautiful story because Jesus talks about going out in twos. And to be honest with you, when I went west, we dropped one off in Manitoba. We caravanned. We dropped a friend off in Saskatchewan, and there was 3 of us in Alberta. But suddenly I was all alone, and I was expected as a 25-year-old who barely knew nothing to get up on a Sunday morning and speak to people and preach God's word. I was terrified. I was like shaken beyond belief behind the pulpit, and at the church door that Sunday, Mary Bars comes up to me. I didn't know that she was a kindergarten teacher. I didn't know that I'd eat more meals at her house twice a week for the next year than my whole life. But Mary came up to me and she said, can I be your Alberta mother? You are the most homesick preacher kid I've ever seen in my life. The story is so profound today. What Jesus says, though, he doesn't say take, an ammunition of a bunch of Bibles you're going to whack people over the head with as a fundamentalist. Jesus talks about going light, traveling light, not worrying about material things. He's telling his followers, in fact, when you go, be yourself, bring peace to the house. And you know what? Jesus is so real. Sometimes they're going to reject you. Oh, isn't that astonishing? I remember Reverend David's laughing here, but I still remember that moment when I was with the supervisor and he said, John, not everybody's going to like you. What are you talking about? Woo! That was a bit of a wake up. Not everybody will like you. And I said, well, I hope they love me. But, and Jesus says pretty clearly, kick the dust off your sandals. You have to let certain things in life go. You have to. And we know that in our own lives. Most of all about this story, what grabs me, though, is that ultimately we're to trust God. And that's probably the hardest thing that most of us have to face in life. And I remember as a younger minister, it was a case of, if we didn't get people in the pews, you always thought it was up to you to do that, forgetting that, actually, you know what? That's the Spirit. That's God. It's God. God's working through the big church. God's working through the world. And so trusting God. And then as a song is shared with us today, you have a grandchild that is living with Asperger's or schizophrenia, or you have a child in your life that's just battling depression, or, as Brené Brown says so well in her Daring Greatly book, she challenges a lot of us parents today, and I include myself in that. And Andrea gets this as a teacher herself. So often parents today get caught up in trying to protect our children from everything. That they can't fail. They can't have to face tough times. And as hard as it is for the parent and for all of us, the truth of the matter is we grow so much. Of course, we want to protect our kids, not to the point that they don't learn that they can stand on their own 2 feet, that they can learn to practice as a student, whether it's piano or voice, that they can do their homework, and they can get help. And probably my middle daughter has taught me the thing that's also a part of the story that I'd like to really close with. My Melissa, with a learning disability, has taught me, Dad, the biggest thing in life is we got to ask for help and not be afraid to be vulnerable to ask for help. And Nancy always says to me, John, the best surgeons, the best doctors I ever work with, the best, when they get into trouble and it's beyond what they've ever dealt with before, and it does happen sometimes, the best doctors, they have a lifeline. They call another surgeon. They might call someone from Kitchener. They'll call somebody else and say, hey, I'm not sure, I need some help. Those will always be the ones you want to count on because they know that they need more than themselves. It's a lesson for all of us. So I don't know if anybody here has a story about vulnerability that you've learned in your life, but not to put you on the spot, David, but is there anything that jumps out at you? I am putting you on the spot, but...
Thank you, John. I'll do something nice to you someday. But I can tell you a story when I was vulnerable. And to understand this story, you have to understand that the last time I was in a hospital was when I was about 11. And many years later, my doctor discovered a kidney stone. And it was too big to be taken out in the usual way. No, I had to go to London. And I want to tell you, I was absolutely terrified because a very dear friend of ours had died from what is relatively minor surgery on the operating table. And I can remember coming in and thinking, I am so scared. And I'd asked for a chaplain, and she came. A nurse, however, was the most helpful person. She listened to me, and then she said, you're not in a good space. Well, I knew that. But she said, I want to tell you something. I'm going to check and see who the anesthetist is. And she came back a few minutes later, and I can't remember the anesthetist's name now, but she said to me, I want you to know that if I were undergoing surgery, that's the anesthetist I'd want. And the other thing she did, Heather was with me, but the other thing she did was when my son arrived, you were only supposed to have one family member with you, but Jeffrey came. I was so scared because you don't stop being scared. But I also knew that somehow it would be all right. And of course it was. But I had to admit to my fear. I couldn't just say, oh, everything's fine. You don't have to worry about me. I'm tough and I'm rough. I had to admit that I was scared down to my toenails, and I was. So that's my story.